Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Rarely, if ever, does the speech get translated into a book, but that's the story behind today's show. Last year, Shashi Tharoor made a brilliant speech at the Oxford Union claiming that the British Raj was a disaster for India. This evening, the Vice President will launch his book on the subject, and here it is. It's called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. And with me to talk about the book is Shashi Tharoor himself. Shashi, let's start with the areas where you make a strong case against the Raj, and then in part two, after the break, I'll come to those areas where perhaps your argument is less than convincing.
Okay.
And let's start with the economy. You point out that in 1600, when the British East India Company was first established, India's share of world GDP was 23%, Britain's was just 1.8%. But by the time the British left India, India's share had plummeted to 3%, the British has shot up to 10%. Is it your case that Britain became a prosperous country by impoverishing India?
Exactly. That essentially Britain took one of the richest countries in the world and transformed it in 200 years to one of the poorest. It did so through a series of measures, including the dismantling of Indian industry, the expropriation of Indian wealth, rapacious taxation, the draining of Indian resources to Britain, which in turn fueled Britain's industrial revolution. And at the end of all that, it proceeded to grow, as it were, on the proceeds not only of the colony in India, but also of her colonies elsewhere in the world, into one of the richest countries in the world. And therefore, Indian exploitation, the oppression of India, the depredations in India financed the rise of Britain.
In fact, your book has several examples of the way Britain impoverished India. Perhaps the most telling, perhaps the most striking, is the story of what happened to the Indian textile industry. Now, you point out that at the start of the 18th century, India's share of global trade was 25%, but by the time the British left, not only had that share been completely destroyed, but the Indian market was now being flooded with cloth from British mills. What exactly did the British do to destroy the Indian textile industry?
Well, first of all, they actually physically smashed the looms. In at least one notorious incident recorded by a Dutch contemporary, they cut off the thumbs of weavers in what is today Bangladesh. There are certainly disputes about that from the British side, but not everything was very well documented in those days. And this was, after all, a European observer who reported it. There were certainly tariffs imposed that made it impossible for Indian textiles to be easily exported anymore, whereas British textiles are brought in with practically no tariffs and duties payable, so they flooded the market and became cheaper. On top of that, when machinery was invented in the Western world to manufacture cloth more cheaply, India was denied that for a long time, till well into the late 19th century. So ultimately, when people say, oh, it wasn't that we did anything wrong to your textile industry, it so happened that yours was a handloom thing, the world was turning industrial, so you missed the bus. My answer is we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels.
And in fact, the second example you take, in a sense, is even more striking than this. You talk about the railways. Now, most people look upon the railways as a great achievement of the Raj, but you point out that the exorbitant cost at which the railways were built in India was actually nothing short of loot. Your comment in your book is, and I'm going to quote it to you, that the railways was a big British colonial scam. It was a splendid racket for everyone apart from the Indian taxpayer.
Exactly.
What are the key statistics and details here?
Oh, it's quite amazing. First of all, as you know, the purpose of the railways in any case was to extract Indian resources, to exploit the Indian hinterland, to move labor about more easily in order to get goods, raw materials and so on from parts of India which had earlier been less accessible and bring them to the ports to ship them off for the benefit of Britain. So to begin with, the very purpose of the railways was self-seeking. Nonetheless, on top of that, they promised the British investor such vast profits by the standards of those days that investing in the Indian railways became the highest remunerated possible investment on the British Stock Exchange. And Indian Railways guaranteed returns whether the railways made losses or profits, because the returns were guaranteed by the Indian taxpayer. That's what made it a colonial scam. On top of that, I go through a great number of details of everything to do with it. The fact that that 1 mile of Indian railway ended up costing 5 times what the same mile would have cost in America or Britain, simply because of the way in which...
9 times.
9 times in some...
In India, it cost £18,000 per mile in the 50s and 60s
That's
of the
right.
19th century.
And
in America, it was just
2,000.
2,000. No,
2,000
9 times more.
Yes, it was 9 times during that period. It did become, and when people woke up to the alarming exploitation, it averaged out at about 5 times, but 9 times during the initial 2 decades, yes.
Now, a third area, and it's one that actually will take most people by surprise, but it's still to do with the economy. But this is where you say, and I'm going to quote you, that the British created rural poverty as a direct result of their actions.
Absolutely.
Your argument is that by monopolizing industrial production, not just in textiles, but literally right across the board, they drove Indians to agriculture in numbers which the countryside and the land simply couldn't sustain, the result of which was, by the time independence happened, India inherited grinding rural poverty.
Yes.
Rural poverty was a British creation.
Absolutely, but that wasn't the whole argument. That's one part of the argument. Another part of the argument was the rapacity of British taxation. You see, in the past in India, taxation was much more reasonable. In as much as we can deduce from the documents available in the pre-British era, taxation never exceeded 15% of the proceeds of the land. In the British case, the lowest it ever was 45%, and very often it included taking the entire crop off the peasant's back. But 85 to 90 was common in terms of taxation. Secondly, in India, taxation was levied with humanity. In other words, where the landlord or the petty king, whoever, said, there's a famine or a drought going on, the peasant can't pay, he didn't have to pay. If there was a marriage or a festival going on, he was given a discount or a reduction, or people were prepared to wait. None of those for the Brits. Everything was by the book, it was law, it was rule. You have to pay this much. If you don't pay it, you can be pilloried physically in the marketplace, you can be whipped, you can be tortured. All of this was done, and I've recounted some of the gruesome incidents of how this was done.
So in
with
fact,
the
you're
result
saying
that peasants actually fled some of the lands controlled by the British East India Company to go into princely states where they felt they'd be treated like human beings.
So in fact, there was a double whammy. On the one hand, there was no industrial job that was really available
That's
because
right.
the industry had been wiped out by the British because of their competition. And secondly, after they pushed them onto the land and forced them into agriculture in a way that was unsustainable, the taxation then came in and actually wiped them out a second time round.
Exactly. And on top of that, there was one more complication, which is the British land settlement policy, where they tried to replicate the squirearchy of the mid-counties that they were familiar with in England by converting very often people who'd really just been rent collectors under the old regimes into permanent landlords who now owned the land, whereas a tiller who'd always assumed the land was his suddenly found himself a tenant. All of this was a great British contribution towards landlessness in India.
So am I right in saying that your conclusion about the overall impact of the British Raj on the Indian economy possibly comes from the following sentence in your book? And I'm going to quote it in full. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's biggest source of revenue, the world's biggest purchaser of British exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants and soldiers, all at India's own expense. And then you add, Indians paid, in other words, for the privilege of being conquered by the British.
That's exactly right. And we haven't even talked about the destruction of the shipbuilding industry, the steel industry. India had the famous Ukku steel, or wood steel as they wrongly called it in Europe. There was a time when the British were attacking India at the beginning of their conquest, that when they shot Indian soldiers, they would dismount from their horses and steal the Indian swords because they were so much better than any European swords available. And here, India's steel industry was completely destroyed, as it were, in order to benefit what became the British steel industry in the Industrial Revolution.
Even someone like Jamshedji Tata, who set up India's first steel plant, had to do so against the odds. He wasn't encouraged by the British,
he was
actually had to
discouraged.
defy them.
He had to defy them. In fact, a British official, after he overcame various hurdles that took years, strictly speaking, the first production started after his death because it took so long to get the factory up and running, actually said that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing.
And your book says, luckily he didn't have to because it would have given him awful indigestion.
Well, if he had lived long enough to see the descendants of the same Mr. Tata acquiring the remnants of British steel by buying chorus, that would have given him a very
Now
bad
you
case
have
of
in your
heartburn.
book some very interesting calculations about how much money Britain extracted from India. Quoting the British writer William Digby, you say in the 19th century alone, Britain extracted £4,187,000,000 pounds. And of the earlier period, 1765 to 1815, you say on average 18 million pounds per year was extracted. Now,
That's very conservative, by the way.
and for that period, these are astronomical sums of money.
Absolutely.
The question is, how reliable are these figures, or are they just guesstimates?
Well, Digby's book is 790 pages long, so he substantiates his arguments in quite extensive and somewhat dull detail. Dadabhai Naoroji did his own calculations a little before Digby, and though he doesn't do a total the way Digby does, he also gave example after example of how significant sums of money were sent out, and he also points to the balance sheets of the British government, not just the British East India Company, because there were always little entries under headings like miscellaneous and others and so on, which actually masked how much of Indian revenues were simply being shipped off to England for no good reason whatsoever.
Now, I'm moving now from the economy to another area where, in fact, your book is pretty devastating in its critique of the British Raj, the Raj's handling of famines, and in particular the way you point out that either they were deliberately neglectful or worse still, they actually exacerbated Indian famines. Now, you point out that in the 19th century, actually from 1770 to 1900, some 25 million Indians died in famine. And if you add to that the total of the 20th century, the figure goes up to 35 million.
That's correct.
How does that compare with horrific instances like Stalin's collectivism or Mao's Cultural Revolution?
Precisely. In fact, Stalin, I think, was accused of having killed about 20 million people, Mao about 15, though the figures are, of course, impossible to verify. The truth is that
this was greater.
This was greater. At the very least, it was comparable. Will Durant, the American historian, said this British rule in India was the greatest crime in all human history, which perhaps to some would seem like an exaggeration. But when you stack it up against the horrendous atrocities committed by the worst dictators, Britain doesn't exactly come out smelling pretty. I mean, it always churns my gut to see Churchill being hailed as a hero when he presided over and directly caused through his decisions the deaths of 4 million people in the Bengal famine, which, given the nature of the fact of British rule, the fact that there were British officials telling him of the consequences of his policies, and all he could write on the margin of a file was, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" I mean, this man is being hailed as a hero and a democrat by Brits. It sickens one to the core.
Let me explain that point a little further for the audience, because they may not having read your book, fully understand why you're so angry about Churchill. Churchill is an example where the British not only were negligent and didn't provide relief during a famine, but exacerbated it by exporting Indian grain and allowing Indians themselves to go hungry. And in particular, this was British policy done deliberately, allegedly in the name of the war or allegedly in the name of soldiers during the 43 famine.
That's right. Churchill's was because of the war. But if you go right back to the beginning of the British famine policy, as it were, they had three rationales. The first was free trade principles. You know, free trade should not be interfered with. Second was this Malthusian philosophy that if people died, it's because the land couldn't sustain them, so that was natural and normal. That was nature correcting itself. The third was the belief that you can't in any case exceed the limits of fiscal prudence. You can't spend money you haven't budgeted for. Therefore, no assistance for famines was a conscious, deliberate policy.
They created principles which actually may not be principles at all to justify denying Indians help.
True, but this was their belief. They applied the same principles to the Irish famine, which is why so many Irish people died and so many emigrated to America. So these were the sincere, wrongly held beliefs of the Brits, but they were so nasty that when, for example, heartbroken sort of individuals tried to offer charity, they were actually threatened with punishment and expulsion from India for actually offering charity to the starving and the dying.
In fact, your conclusion once again on this particular part of your book, which is about the famines and the toll that it took on the Indian population and the negligence or the exacerbated manner in which the British handled the situation, is the following. The death toll from the colonial Holocaust is right up there with some of the most harrowing examples of man's inhumanity to man in modern times.
Correct.
In other words, it's very hard to exceed the inhumanity the British showed.
I am afraid so. And in the case of Churchill, by the way, we said the war was his excuse, but he was actually shipping grain off for reserve stocks, not to actually feed any human beings. And this was grain that would otherwise have fed starving and dying human beings.
Now, in fact, the amazing thing, and this comes out in your book, is that a fair number of British writers, politicians, and historians were actually well aware at the time of what Britain was doing, aware that it was being done deliberately, and spoke about it fairly bluntly. In your book, you quote a gentleman called F.G. Shaw, who in 1857 said to the House of Commons, "The fundamental principle of the English has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient in every possible way to the interests and benefits of themselves." Almost 100 years later, in 1928, Sir William Hicks, who was the Home Secretary of the time, said, "I know it's said in missionary meetings that we conquered India to raise the level of the Indians. That is cant. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. We went with a yardstick in one hand and a sword in the other, and with the latter we continue to hold them helpless whilst we force the former down their throats." The Brits were pretty unabashed about what they were doing. They weren't in denial. They actually, in a sense, were boasting of what they were doing.
Well, some of these statements were actually made behind closed doors. They've endured in the records, and so we're able to find them. But by and large, there was also a lot of self-justificatory mythologizing about the missionary spirit and all the good they were doing, which is what Hicks was alluding to in his remarks behind closed doors. So the truth is that things were said that today damn the British in hindsight, but at the time were not known. Lord Lytton, for example, wrote to London during the implementation of Queen Victoria's declared policy of allowing Indians into the British civil service to openly admit that this was hypocritical, that they were never going to give any Indians any real power or authority in the imperial civil services. That was going to be something that was a lie. And he said it's far better we're open and honest about it and don't hire these people in the first place. But why hire them? And once we hire them, we can only mistreat them because we can't give them any real authority over the English. Now that kind of thing they would never say publicly, but these were all there in private correspondence and in the records.
But even if they didn't say it privately, they did admit to themselves that they were actually in India for reasons of exploitation, but that didn't put them off continuing to exploit.
That's right, exactly.
I mean, they admitted it, but continued to do so.
Well, that's what they were there for.
All right, Shashi, let's take a break at that point. When we come back, I want to flip the discussion. No longer will I talk to you about areas where you make a strong case against the British Raj. I want to come to those areas where perhaps your case is less convincing. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and we're discussing Shashi Tharoor's new book, which is launched by the Vice President this evening. Here it is. It's called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. The book claims that the British Raj was a disaster for India. In part one, we talked about all those areas where Shashi has a strong and convincing case to make. Now we come to areas where perhaps his case is less than convincing. Shashi, let's come to the areas where the Raj had a beneficial impact on India. Speaking at Oxford University in 2005, Dr. Manmohan Singh said, and I'm quoting him, "It's possible for an Indian Prime Minister to assert that India's experience with Britain had its beneficial consequences too." And he lists the rule of law, constitutional government, a free press, a professional civil service, modern universities, the judiciary, the army, the police, and of course the English language. Would you, to begin with, accept that these are areas where British colonial rule and experience was markedly and significantly different to Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and Belgian colonial rule?
Well, there were differences, and I don't claim to be an expert on the others. I know how awful the Belgians were. The French were actually relatively more progressive than the British, certainly when it comes to things like rule of law and constitutionalism, and their willingness to assimilate the conquered, much better than the British. But having said that, let's not go into the comparative thing. Let me agree with the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, that there were benefits, but let me stress that those benefits were entirely incidental and not part of the core purpose in introducing any of these things.
But that is an interpretation. That is an interpretation.
No, but every one of these things was introduced by the British for the self-avowed purpose of furthering British rule in India, British control over India, and it was Indians who managed to take of them eventually the benefits that we enjoy today.
All right, let me take an example. Now, let's begin with freedom of the press, and I'm going to only cite instances that come from your book. As far back as 1889, the Bengali newspaper Halishar Patrika, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, called the British Lieutenant Governor of the day the baboon Campbell with a hairy body. In 1891, a journalist from Amrit Bazar Patrika rummaged in the waste paper basket of the Viceroy and put together the fragments of a torn letter, which the paper then published, and that ended up thwarting British attempts to annex Kashmir. Now I ask you, if something like that were to happen today, not just under Mr. Modi, but even arguably under Dr. Manmohan Singh, you and I know precisely how the government would have acted. They would have literally throttled the newspaper. The British didn't. They accepted it. Surely that is proof that they permitted freedom of the press.
Well, I can also point to the very large number of Indian editors who were tried for sedition, various other offences, publishers whose deposits were confiscated by the British, journalists who were shipped off to the Andamans because of things they wrote. These, number one, vastly outnumbered the good examples, and number two, they actually did not, in fact, ever impose any such experience, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th, on the pro-British newspapers. So it was very much selective and one-sided application of press freedom. Granted,
can I interrupt
we
there?
had no press in India before the
Can I interrupt
Brits.
there? How different is what you're citing to disprove the point I'm making from the situation today, where NDTV censors an interview with one of your most senior leaders on the grounds that it's a drivel, and now the government has taken NDTV off the air on the 9th of November as punishment for something it's done. I mean, it seems to me that independent India is no different and certainly no better than what British India was under the Brits as far as freedom of the press is concerned.
But you know, two wrongs don't make one of them right, Karan. The fact that there have been, I believe, serious flaws in our own governance after independence. We could all find examples of things that either state governments or central government have done that we don't approve of, including the very example you cite. And for that matter, that sometimes commercial press outlets prefer caution, if you like, to courage. I mean, as we've seen with the NDTV decision you mentioned, all of that does not excuse the fact that the British had a different yardstick for Indian journals and newspapers than they had for British.
Okay.
By the way, Halishad Patrika's thing, it's very interesting because they then passed the Vernacular Press Act to curb this kind of invective against them, which is one of the reasons why Amrita Bazar Patrika, which had been founded as a Bengali paper, became an English language.
Don't forget, it was Rajiv Gandhi who wanted to pass acts to actually curb the freedom of the press, and luckily, in fact, Dr. Zail Singh as president sat on it. So, you know, we've got multiple examples, and I don't want to get into that controversy with you. Let me move on. There are times when your case that Britain cannot be credited for India's democracy is based upon what I call bizarre counterfactuals and actually simply guesswork. You write that if the British hadn't come, and I'm quoting you, the Marathas would have ruled the country under the nominal overlordship of a weak Mughal monarch.
They were doing that already.
And then you add, this would have led to an inevitable transition to constitutional rule, just as England transitioned from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. And I ask you a simple question. How on earth can you know and believe that? Because look at China, look at Nepal, look at Thailand. They were never colonies, but you can barely call them democracies or only just, and you certainly can't call China a democracy. No. We might have ended up without British rule like Nepal or Thailand or China. Perish the thought.
No, Nepal and Thailand are fair comparisons, and they're both countries which did indeed evolve constitutional monarchies in which power was actually held by elected, or sometimes in the case of Thailand, armed civilians. I mean, the fact is that you did have politics rising up inevitably.
It's questionable whether what Nepal ever had could be called constitutional monarchy, except if you're being kind about the description. Let's be honest.
What about Japan? I mean, why must you only take parallels that you feel represent deficient models of what I'm suggesting? I stress
because they contradict your conclusion.
No, because counterfactuals, after all, in any case are speculative, and I acknowledge that right up in the book.
Guesswork in this case
is as good as mine, but you know, look at how Japan evolved. Why couldn't India have done that?
All right. There's a 50% chance we could have become Japan, and a 50% chance we could have ended up as Thailand and Nepal.
Very low. But you know, there would have been, because of the size of the country, there would have been lots and lots of relatively autonomous places. So I'm not quite sure it would ever have become.
You could have ended up with anarchy.
Now, come on.
In fact, what's worse is you rubbish the argument that Britain gave India parliamentary democracy by actually saying that presidential rule would have been more preferable, a presidential system, and better suited to India than a parliamentary democracy. Now, A, that's debatable and questionable.
Yeah, it is debatable.
B, it's a separate point. But most importantly, C, it doesn't undermine or detract from the fact that parliamentary democracy is a British legacy.
Yes and no. The British actually, first of all, didn't give us at any stage of their reforms what they promised. Minto Morley reforms were a damp squib. Montagu-Chelmsford was much less than India had expected after the First World War. And the Government of India Act in 1935 also had limited franchise and separate electorates for religious minorities. So the British never gave us what we today see as parliamentary democracy. It was our Constituent Assembly that actually adopted the parliamentary democracy that we know and the universal franchise that went with it, which the British never gave us. So the point is, whatever democracy we had up to 1947 had to be prized from their reluctant grasp. And after 47, the democracy we know today was
But it was what we learned from the British that we deliberately copied, that we gave ourselves, makes it a British legacy.
Yes, to
Nehru
that degree,
consciously.
but it was nonetheless India. Just as the English language is an English language, it came from the English, but our nationalists seized upon the English language as an instrument of Indian nationalism.
I'll come to the
Dadabhai Naoroji or Jawaharlal Nehru.
I'll come to the English language.
What about the rule of law?
I'll come to the English language in a moment. In fact, I want to come to the rule of law because that was precisely another area where you counter the claim that the Raj gave us the rule of law by arguing that, in fact, the Raj gave us an oppressive legacy.
Exactly.
That's your precise phrase, because it gifted us a crime of sedition and Section 377.
But not just that. I talk about how the British applied the law of murder so selectively that no Briton was ever convicted practically of murdering an Indian.
But on those 2 points, the Section 377 and the crime of sedition, what you forget is that the same laws applied in Britain at the time, and more importantly...
No. The sedition law that was imposed in India was far harsher than the one that applied in Britain. And I've quoted the Secretary of Law, Secretary of State in 1893.
The second thing that you ignore, the second thing you ignore, even if I concede the fact that the sedition law in Britain was harsher, is that Britain went on to repeal both of them, and India not only retained them, but Nehru consciously, in fact, chose to retain sedition in the harder, tougher form that you refer to it as. He's there on record saying that he wishes to retain it, even though he regrets having to do so. And your government, in the last 10 years when you were in power, had an opportunity to repeal 377, but consciously chose not to do so.
Well, actually, my government, in all fairness, by the time that they'd come around to that position, the Delhi High Court judgment seemed to make it unnecessary. So we just let the High Court judgment stand and chose not to appeal it. Then,
but you knew that the High Court judgment could be overturned on appeal to the Supreme Court. The appeal had happened.
By the time it was overturned, there was only, unfortunately, 1 2-week session of Parliament left to pass a vote on account before the Code of Conduct.
That I understand.
So
you could have moved immediately after the Delhi High Court decision to actually repeal it so that there was no need for an appeal further, because you'd have settled the matter legislatively. But you didn't.
Well, I've said in the book, I'm not excusing any of today's conduct, but the fact is these laws came down from those days. And the fact is that, yes, Indians have retained them, unfortunately, but if they hadn't been there in the first place, there'd be nothing to retain, would there?
That's true. What about something else?
What about the way in which murder was applied to Indians?
Let's come to something else. The British, I concede, are racist. But equally, it's only the British that would have given in to Gandhi, Satyagraha and non-violence.
I concede that.
Non-violence would never have worked
against Hitler
or for that matter, against Soviet occupation of Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, or for that matter, against Pol Pot in Cambodia.
Yeah.
But it worked against the British, and that tells you something about the British.
Well, I concede that. That's one of the points I actually concede in the concluding chapter.
Grudgingly.
So, of course, grudgingly. but at the same time, they had no business to be here in the first place, but since they were here, at least their own system obliged them to play by certain rules that, say, the Nazis in Germany would never have. So their own system, meaning their own free press, the accountability to their own public opinion, political opinion, and so on, obliged them to behave in a certain manner. And that definitely made Gandhiji's extraordinary achievement possible.
Let me put this, and I accept that it's a difficult and awkward question, but do you think Gandhi could have succeeded, non-violence and Satyagraha could have succeeded, if our colonial rulers were not the British, but say the French, or the Dutch, or worse still, the Belgian?
See, we're again venturing into counterfactuals.
Absolutely.
With the Belgians, probably not, because given how cruel they were in the Congo, they might have shot a Gandhi before he ever got to a point where he could have done anything. And they essentially got away with it because in the Congo there wasn't very much freedom or democracy or liberty around. But India was a different place, and I don't know whether...
And Algeria had to go through a brutal civil war before it got its independence, and the French weren't ready to leave at all, were they?
True, but the French approach was different. The French had chosen to assimilate into Nigeria. There were people of French background descent who had settled there permanently, and Algerians were equally welcome in France as French people.
Until the Mem Sahib came to India, that was true of the British.
That didn't last very long. The Mem Sahib started coming to India by the 1820s.
So we've got to blame it on the woman in this case.
To some degree, the fishing fleet did transform these attitudes and ossify to some degree this racism.
Finally, what about the English language? For instance, if the British hadn't come and taught us English, you and I would be speaking English like the Chinese and the Thais.
Yes, but wouldn't it have been nicer to learn English from a whole bunch of toothsome VSOs rather than because of the stout British boot of a burly sergeant? I mean, the truth is that what little English was left behind here, as you know, and Macaulay said it explicitly, was left behind to create a small, narrow class to serve as interpreters between the governors and the governed, between the rulers and the ruled, and that's what they wanted to do.
I don't deny
the Indians took it up and went beyond
I
what
don't
the Brits
deny the
intended.
Macaulayan intention, but the result and the consequence is quite different. English has united us as a country, which otherwise we may never have linguistically achieved. And let me put it like this: if English hadn't been the language, the book we're discussing may well have been written in Malayalam and could have been limited in its appeal to Kerala. The fact that you can hope to appeal to a pan-Indian audience is because it's in English. That's the gift of the British, and that is another point that you don't really acknowledge in your book.
I say that we seized upon some things that the British left behind, which were not intended really to serve anything but imperial interests. As I said, the English language as applied by the British to India was accompanied by racism, by discrimination. For example, the mistreatment of the Indians in the Indian civil service. There was always the assumption the language is a tool that you may use to serve our purposes. The moment you use it for your own advancement, we'll clamp down on you. So I can't grant the British any credit for that. I grant credit to the Indians who took the language, expanded its uses, applied it to nationalist causes, and indeed persisted with it after independence.
Let me see if we can agree on this. There are clear benefits from the Raj, as Dr. Manmohan Singh has said, and as you grudgingly accept, but they weren't intended by the British as benefits.
Exactly.
However, whatever the intention may have been, the consequence has been beneficial to us. That we have to accept.
Absolutely. Cricket's a prime example, perhaps.
In which case, let me end by putting this to you. Your book is a searing indictment of the Raj. If its best reception happens to be in London, what will you say?
I'd be surprised. In fact, my British publishers are bracing themselves for an onslaught of negative reviews because the book doesn't really give any quarter. And I think there's been just so much of this romanticizing of all the sort of benign altruism, to quote this author Lawrence James, of the British Empire, especially in India, that I think it would come as a rude shock, and rude is what many would think it would be. But if it does happen, Karan, maybe your Anglophilia will turn out to be better justified than my cynicism.
Shashi Tharoor, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.